All right, we're going to talk about Node Fundamentals, Node Fundamentals Part 1. And in this lecture, it's going to be talking about modules, export, and require. And then we're going to do some of that event-driven architecture and how we handle events and event emitting in Node.js. So fundamentals 1, module export require. If you remember ES6, we talked about classes and modules and how to encapsulate code. That's kind of what we're going with in terms of modules. So basically, a module encapsulates all related code into a single unit, so that we can reuse and in a way mimic object-oriented programming in terms of reusability of units of code, right? Like classes and these types of things. So at the time of Node.js, they didn't actually have ES6, so they went this route, module, and that was just a way to stop polluting that global scope that we talked about with JavaScript, and how you can easily overwrite things, and things were basically blowing away scope, right, without using some complex patterns. So basically, a module is a reusable piece of JavaScript which exports specific objects. So basically, inside your encapsulation, you need to pick and choose what, if you don't want to expose all of it, you can expose pieces of the module so that it can be available for other programs. Suppose you had a calculator module and you only wanted to expose, say, add and subtract to the outside world, and you wanted to internally keep divide and multiply. Well, you could actually do that with how you use the export keyword. And there's a couple patterns around, more than a couple actually. There's like 5 or 6 different export patterns that you could use, but for the most part, you're probably going to use 2 or 3 for our purposes. So each module in Node has its own context, as we said, so it doesn't interfere with other modules and doesn't pollute that global scope. That's so important to remember, that this is a way of protecting that global scope. Because Node.js, in fact, has its own global variables, so we don't want to be overwriting those. So if we want to bring the module into our program and we want to include it, we have to use a special keyword, and the keyword is called require. So in order to use node.js core or npm modules, you first need to import it using the require keyword. So the require function will return an object, function, or property, or any other JavaScript type depending on what the specified module returns. So if you look at this example here, this is an example of some project we're going to do, I guess. This is a project that we had done in the past. Basically, it was a movie list with the admin section, and these are the different types of ways you could use require. So the first line there is, it goes and gets a middleware called Express, which we'll talk about later on. Express handles all the HTTP requests and gives you a RESTful API. So we want to pull in everything to do with Express, and we set it as a variable. And then in the next line, we create a variable called app, and we kind of instantiate that object Express. And inside of that module, Express has all the required methods and properties that you would need to build a RESTful API. Body parser is a middleware product. We'll talk about middleware later on. Mongoose, it's ORD, sort of like ORM. It's an object relational data mapper for MongoDB, and you're pulling that in to use that API. And then we have some custom uh, modules that we created. So we have some routes that pertain to Express. There's a movie router, and there's an admin router, and those are going to go and handle all of the different URL requests when we're building this thing out. And then we include a model. So const movie require. So we have some type of model that we're bringing into the scope. So that's basically what require does in requiring modules. It basically brings those modules in and allows you to use them inside of your code file. So 3 sources of node modules. And again, we saw that node modules directory and we dug through it a little bit, but there's the built-in modules that come prepackaged with Node. So there is FS, file system, HTTP, which we talked about, crypto for cryptology, OS. There's also a whole bunch of other ones like net and things like that for networking. So basically, what we want to do is we want to go and we want to require it. Uh, Here we're using var f equal required foo, but you can use const and let as those ES6 syntax. And then again, we're requiring in the module to use. Another one is, aside from the built-in ones, your own project files. So like if we need to create a route, like in the other example, a router or a model or data model or things like that, we can bring those in. Some notes there is that each JS file is its own module, and then a way to modularize. It's just a way to modularize your application's code. So you don't want all of this. Ideally, you don't want all your code in one file. Say you have an app.js, you don't want to have all your router routes in there. You don't want to have all your your setup. Suppose you're doing socket IO, you might want to extract all of that stuff out. Maybe have a socket manager that just deals with socket IO connections. You might want to have that a router kind of handler that just deals with all the routes. You want to extract out as much as you can from these files and not have like 2,000 lines of code of mixed concerns, right? You want to separate out the concerns. So each file is required in the file system. You got to make sure that when you're requiring that you are actually going into the right directory. That can cause some problems. It may say I can't find this project file because you don't have the path right. Sorry, continue on to variables are marked for export. So like we said, there's patterns to exporting. So this is an example of how you would have a file, and you would actually inside of it you would have a method or function, and then in order to expose it to the world you would need to use module.exports.greeter equals greeter. So that's one way of doing it. There's a couple other ways. You could actually say module exports greeter equals function. You could put on those lines. So basically you can export a function directly, or you can export the entire, if you had a class, say a class, ES6 class, export the entire class, or you could export a collection of items, or sorry, properties or methods in the bottom of in the bottom line for module.export. So there's a few different patterns there, and I encourage you to go take a look at that link there on the bottom to look at those patterns. But the question here was, is answers available to the caller? Like what variable is available and to the outside world? And the answer is private, internal to the module, because it's not being exported. The only thing that's being exported there is a greeter function. And if you had, say, a couple other functions beside this one, the only one that would be seen outside externally would be the greeter. Another source, of course, is that Node Package Manager, or NPM registry, that we talked about previously, we've been using. So that's another way of including Node modules in your project. And we talked all about how you can find a bunch of great stuff there and how to use NPM to install those packages. And the same thing, once they're installed, your package.json file gets updated. It then adds itself to the node modules directory. Then all you have to do is require it, and it's available to you to use inside of your code. So third-party modules via Node Package Manager. Again, you're going to use the npm install module name, and you're going to do that on the command line. It's going to put it into the Node modules folder. Again, adding the required identifier to bring it in. Some modules provide command line utilities like Express. You can use Express and run it on the command line. It's a really handy feature. You can go and scaffold out an entire app using Express. It'll do all the setup for you. It's really great. Another one, Mocha. You can install Mocha, which is a testing suite. Once you install it, it has a little CLI you can use. And again, there's some flags on the install. There's install-global, and there's also install/save. and save dash dev dev to make it more local to your project and give dev dependencies. So how do these modules really work? And how they work is requires the function that you pass the path to, and then module export is what the required function returns. And this all works because your code is actually wrapped in a function that is given these things as function parameters. So Node does a bunch of wrapping for you, and it basically encapsulates all of that for you, and it'll actually, when you require it in, it'll actually execute that function and make it available to you. Before I wanted to go on to event emitters, I just wanted to look at this require module and export quickly. So in our Visual Studio code, we have two code files. We have this app.js, which is our main entry point. We just have a hello world. You at the command line using our node command, our node shell. We can say node.app.js, and it simply says, oh, I can't find it. That's what it says. So again, c dot dot will change directory and go back to the directory, and then dir will show what's in your directory. So I want to do, and by the way, you can actually use the arrow keys. A little tip: you can scroll through your list of commands. Saves you a bit of time from writing them again. You have a whole bunch. So node app.js, hello world. So all right, we have an entry point here, and what we want to do is we have some pre-built modules. So we have a simple one here called circle. So inside circle, it just says, what does it have here? It's using a built-in math function, and I'm pulling out the constant pi, which is of course 3.14, whatever else the rest of the number is. And then I have a method called area, and I'm using arrow function here, and basically, it's if you remember ES syntax, this is short forming a little bit. The long syntax would be area equals function with the parameter r, and then some more braces, a little bit like that. So it makes it a little bit nicer if we were to, again, if we were to see, so it would look more familiar to you. Sometimes if you don't need a parameter, it'll actually, you don't need to put those parentheses around that. It can be done in one line if that makes more clarity to you. It's not needed though, but just if it actually reminds you of the ES syntax with the arrow, that's what it is. So basically we have an area. So when I do control save, I have prettier installed, which is an extension, and it kind of will clean this code up for me. That's why you saw it disappear. So I'm exposing this area function that basically will take a variable r, times it by pi, times it by 2, times 2. Circumference, again, takes a variable r, times pi times r. So just a couple math functions. Again, we may not need to know how it works. If it's a built-in module, it may be encapsulated. We can't see inside of it. But if we wanted to use this now in this code here, we don't need this. We don't need this console log anymore. We can walk up to it and say, we're going to say circle equals require dot circle. So then we have access to it. And then if we wanted to console log that circle method dot, and if you notice here, dot area and dot circumference is available, but pi is not. And as we talked about, pi is internal and private to this module, and it's not exported. If we wanted to export this, we would have to actually export it with the export keyword. So here we have dot area, and we're going to pass it in. It's expecting a number, so we'll just say 2, and then we'll go ahead, walk up to that and run this, and node.app.js, so it's going to give us 12.566, whatever have you. If we wanted to actually give this some meaning here, I just actually use some template variable there, template literal. Remember the backtick. So now we have the string, and it's actually going to populate it with circle.area equals 4. If we want to use square, now square is another one. Square is a little bit different. It's a class, and it basically is exporting this entire class. And when you export that and call it, it's going to instantiate this class object. We haven't talked about class yet, but basically it's part of object-oriented programming. When you have a class, you have an encapsulation around it. So basically, you're exporting this entire class, and it's doing some work internally. If you haven't done classes before, we'll talk about this later on. Basically, know that it's going to expose an area object. So we can go back to our app.js. We may not need to know how that works, but know that we don't need to know the internal workings of that, but just know that we can use that. So if we say require dot slash square, now we have square available to us. Now we can walk up and use it in the same way. We can say square dot. So now area is available to us, this method here, and we're going to pass it 5, and then when we run this, we will have access to, we would have called, so now it says something, there is a problem in here. So it says area is not defined, and that's right, because it's probably just it is probably not exposed. We are handling it in a different way, and right, how we had to actually call this was, we can't call it in the same way as circle because of that fact that it is a object. We have to call it in this fashion, where let's just say we call it x. I'll quickly, we would say new square. So we are treating it like an actual class, an object, and we pass this in. We pass it into its constructor, if that makes any sense, and then internally it knows what 2 is. So then we can walk up to this and say x dot area. So I'm just showing you this example. You may not have worked with classes before, but they are a little different. You must first instantiate them, and then you must call the methods that are internal to them. You don't always have to do it that way. We can certainly change it around, so that's not needed. But just to show you how this works, this is how you would actually call it. So new square, and then we are actually equals my square, console log, again using template literals. So when we were to go and call that, it should not cause a problem, get angry at us, and that's really how you would do this. So the two differences there is one's a function and one's a class, which is kind of like dramatic foreshadowing, because when we do React, we're going to talk about functional components and class components, and they both have their own different strategies on how to handle parameters and state and things like that. But that's not part of this discussion. This discussion was about how to use modules, how to use require, and how to use exports. And that's what this demo was about.